Any explanation of computer history would not be complete without mentioning Xerox and the Palo Alto Research Center. All the contributions are too many to even list on this channel, but today we're going to take a look at Xerox's first attempt at a microcomputer for the home, the Xerox 820. It's all here on Vintage Geek. Just a quick reminder, if you're into vintage computers and technology, please like and subscribe. It's going to help us a lot as we grow here, and I would encourage you to become a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at our website at vintagegeek.com. In the early course of computer history, Xerox was very involved in research and development. There are so many contributions to the computer industry that were made at the Palo Alto Research Center from Xerox, including the graphical user interface, the modern computer mouse, and a lot of these things were happening as early as the 1960s with the Xerox Alto system. And later, a lot of those features were integrated into something a little bit more modern with the Xerox Star, which came out in the early 1980s. However, Xerox was one of those companies that was kind of going in two different directions. And one of those directions was, of course, its primary business model, which was business systems, such as the Xerox copy machines and printers specifically. Now, I actually do have a good friend that worked at Xerox for many, many years earlier in his career, and he told me that Xerox had a definite problem when it came to a business model for some of those research projects. The Alto, of course, was an amazing machine, but had a very limited amount of appeal in the actual business community due to the fact that its price tag was so incredibly high. Obviously, with that level of tech and the components available at the time, it would have been very difficult to make something in mass production that would be affordable for the average business owner. The Star was no exception. It had a ton of really innovative features, but obviously something that was not accessible to the normal business or certainly home community. Xerox wanted to get into the microcomputing space, but they were kind of doing this from the standpoint of their business side of things rather than the research side of things, and that's where we get the Xerox 820. We have two Xerox 820s here in the collection. One of them is kind of more of a parts model and the other one is more of the show model. But this system is really interesting to me because it's kind of an example of what happens when you try to beat IBM to the punch, which is really what happened with Xerox. They were convinced that they wanted to put a microcomputer out on the market and they wanted to make it available before the upcoming release of the IBM PC. So they decided to rush something in essence to get it out to the market on time, and that's where the 820 came into play. In fact, the CPU board in the 820 model by Xerox was actually made by somebody else. It's called the Ferguson Big Board, and it was a computer kit essentially that was available to the general public as I understand it. It was a single board that contained most of the functions that you would need, including the ability to control floppy disk drives, drive the monitor, and the keyboard I/O functionality as well. They were able to put this into a chassis along with a unit that contained two floppy disk drives, a keyboard, and that was really about it. The board actually came with a Z80 processor, which was pretty commonplace. We've seen that in a lot of other systems that we've covered here on the channel, but there was nothing really innovative per se about the 820 other than the fact that they were trying to beat IBM to the market with the PC. In the end, it really wasn't a hugely successful unit for Xerox. In fact, they projected they were going to sell 100,000 of these, I think, in the first year, and it took more like 4 or 5 years to even hit that number. The IBM PC actually was announced basically a week after this system was launched, which really took a lot of the wind out of their sails, even though the system itself wasn't highly reviewed anyway. So I really want to take a look at this system. It's kind of an example of what Xerox did right, what they did wrong. Let's dive into it a little bit and study the Xerox 820 here on Vintage Geek. Let's start by taking a look at the Xerox 820 keyboard. Now, the first thing that I notice about this is that it's bulky. This thing has quite a bit of size to it. It's got a full set of keys and a number pad and some arrow functions. The actual case of this keyboard seems unnecessarily big. When you look at the actual footprint of the keys themselves and everything going into it, it just really doesn't seem like you would need quite this much physical real estate. It's also pretty high up. So if you were sitting in front of this and you have your wrists up, it's probably not going to be super ergonomic. The keys themselves seem perfectly functional. They've got a good range of movement, and they do have a kind of clicking sound, although there's no actual feedback like you would get from an IBM. There is a help key, which is kind of unique. I haven't seen that in a ton of systems in this era. When you get over to the number key side of the keyboard, things get a little bit different. Now, you do have the standard arrangement of arrows that we've seen on keyboards for decades to come, but it's interesting that the right arrow just kind of blends right into the numeric keypad, or the 10 key over here on the right-hand side of the keyboard. A little bit of a different design choice there, but nothing too out of the box. Certainly would compare to other systems at the time, and seems perfectly functional, albeit very large for what it needs to do. The other thing I find interesting about this keyboard is the actual connector and cable for it. And when you compare this to a IBM system from the time, they had the kind of compact DIN connector and a small wire, whereas this keyboard is really bulky in the cable department. It's got a DB25 connector on it, and I'm not sure exactly all of the different control lines and how this works, but certainly a lot more to the cabling than you would see in some of the earlier keyboards. So there may be more going on inside the physical case of the keyboard. Maybe that's why the size is such a factor here, but I'll have to do a little bit more research to find out about that for sure. This is the matching Xerox 820 disk drive. As I understand it, there were a couple of different configurations that were available when you purchased the 820 system. You could get this unit, which has two 5¼ Shugart floppy drives. Each one of these floppies was capable of doing about 96 kilobytes per disk, which is pretty small compared to some of the other disk formats, but that was fairly common, as I understand it, for CP/M operating systems. So nothing, again, too out of the ordinary there. There was also an 8-inch version of this, which we don't have, that would have had either 1 or 2 8-inch floppy disk drives. So they had kind of some interchangeability built in there on the Xerox side. This, similar to the keyboard, has a very large connector interface on it. And this one actually has, I believe, a 37-pin connector on it and a very large cable. One nice thing about it is that there is no power supply required specifically for the disk drive, so it's actually getting all of the power for the drives from the actual CPU. Other than that, there's really not too much unique about this design. It certainly looks nice. I don't know if it's functionally nice yet, but it's definitely going to be worth a try. And this is the heart of the Xerox 820 system. It includes the actual CRT monitor, which is monochrome, but it is 80 column and has a fairly nice looking display from what I've seen so far. This also contains the entire CPU board, so that Ferguson big board actually sits in the bottom of this particular chassis. Other than that, there's really not a whole lot to talk about on the front of this particular computer other than the Xerox name badge on the front. Similarly, the backplane of the Xerox 820 is pretty simple and self-explanatory in a lot of ways. You start from left to right looking at the reset button, which would reset the system. Then you've got a disk drive connector, which would accommodate that 37-pin we just saw, as well as the keyboard connector directly next to it. Then you've got a printer port, which is another DB25, and a communications port, which is RS-232. I've read that the Xerox 820 can actually do some kind of a terminal emulation mode. I'm not sure how to get it into that mode, but we could theoretically use that port to control something like the Centurion, for example. Now, originally, the Xerox 820 retailed for $2,995, which was pretty expensive, and the critics were quick to point that out. I don't remember the exact price of the IBM PC when new. I think it was slightly more expensive, at least to get the disk drive model and some of the features that the Xerox had, but of course, IBM had some other things going for it, like the DOS compatibility and a lot of other things down the road. But for a basic CP/M machine, this was kind of a first, and Xerox was the second Fortune 500 company to actually come out with a microcomputer, the first being the Tandy Corporation with the TRS-80. So it definitely has a tie-in in the place of computer history. As far as the crazy developmental features that Xerox was working on, we're probably not going to see those here in the 820, but I do want to spend a little bit of time seeing what we can do, and I do want to take a little bit of time to just take a peek under the cover and see how everything is laid out inside. I kind of like the way that this whole thing is put together. So you've got this metal frame that's included in the plastic housing, and then you've got the CRT mounted in front. It's got the copper kind of rail around it. Now, I was actually talking to our in-house technician, Justin, and he told me that the CRT for this was actually made by the Ball Jar Company, which I did not know. That's kind of a fun little tidbit. I assume they made a lot of CRTs at the time. This one seems like it's in pretty clean shape. I don't see anything that's visibly wrong with it right out of the gate. As far as the way things are structured inside, next to the CRT, we've got the power supply for the computer. Looks like all the power supply sections are kind of on this left-hand side mounted to the frame. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the power supply and the logic board for the actual CRT itself. So kind of a little bit of physical separation between those two components within the chassis. Along the bottom of the actual chassis, you've got the Ferguson big board, which is everything else. All of your input-output devices, everything you need to actually make the functioning computer. So it's very basic design. Everything fits together well. It's very easy to take things apart. You can get to everything very easily. I can see the Z80 processor on the board. So, you know, I don't have any objections to the way this was designed, and this is kind of speaking to Xerox's ingenuity. Honestly, it's a pretty clean little system. There's really not a whole lot else to say about the internal components of this until we try to turn it on, and then we have to figure out what we need to fix to get it working. But other than that, I'm ready to give this thing a try. Our most recently acquired Xerox was not in as great of condition cosmetically as the one that we had prior to it, but it did come with all of the original manuals and some of the original software disks, which we did not have previously. The critics at the time were not super complimentary of the documentation that came with the system, but I've already learned a lot from just reading a few pages of it, so I'm glad to have it, that's for sure. Sitting here in front of the system, it's a very cool looking machine. I'm kind of surrounded in the sea of keyboard in front of the monitor. It's kind of a weird feeling, but I like the way it looks overall. It kind of has that early space age feel, and it's kind of cool. The power switch is on the bottom side of the actual monitor CPU unit, so let's go ahead and flip this on and see what happens. Did get a little bit of a drive movement, or kind of an initialization that happened there. And hey, Xerox 820 version 2.0. Looks like we've got two options to start with, A for boot system or T for typewriter. Now A, according to the manual, is gonna load from the floppy disk. So we can put in a CP/M disk, and I'm gonna try the copy disk. I tried this earlier and was not successful in getting CP/M to load, but I'm gonna give it another try now just to see if this copy version will work rather than the master, which may have been problematic for some reason. So we'll put this in drive 0. Let's see what happens if we try to boot. Go right into a disk error. Let's try the other CP/M disk just to see if the error message is the same or if we get something different. Now this disk did not go directly into the error like the first one did, but it's also just spinning. I don't really hear any head movement happening, and this is kind of what we experienced in our initial testing. It seems like the logic is there, but there may be an issue with the head of the drive. The good news is the basic boot ROM of the system does have some limited functionality, and as I understand it, we can actually look at memory addresses, we can save things to memory addresses, and we can do some very basic diagnostics. So I'm going to try that approach since we're not really having a lot of luck getting the disk to load so far. At least we can see what things may be working and not working with this particular system. Now there's some other commands that are listed in the manual that you can get to from this particular screen. The first one that they mention is the dump command, and that is supposed to output a tabular display of the contents of memory in both hex and ASCII format. Let's see what happens if we try to do this. If I just do it without any parameters, there's the whole memory dump right there. And if you've ever used any of the hex editing programs on a modern PC, this is formatted in very much the same way. You have your hexadecimal versions on the left-hand columns here, and then on the right you have what would be the ASCII representation of it. This looks like it's showing memory addresses 0 through 00F0, so that must be some kind of default, I'm guessing. If I put in a start address, start with AAAA, it's giving me a much more complete look at the entire memory contents of the system. I'm going to say here though that the display looks great. Everything is very clear, and it's scrolling through these memory addresses no problem. So I have to assume that the memory in the system is functioning as it expects it to, which is great. It's a lot of memory addresses. Of course, they don't really say in the book what happens if you only put in the starting address rather than a start and end, which is what I did, just the single. Oh, there we go. So it looks like in this particular case, if you only define one, it's going to start at the beginning and then go to that address, because we can see the last line here is AAA0, and then theoretically the last address would be AAAA, which was the value that I put in. There's a test command next, which seems kind of interesting. It says if no errors occur, the test routine will output a plus sign every time a test pass is done. It doesn't like that. It's saying what? Which I actually kind of appreciate as a prompt. In fact, that happens anytime you put in something that it doesn't understand. It simply says what with a question mark, which is kind of cooler than just saying a syntax error, I guess. That's one of those user-friendly things that Xerox brought to the table, so I appreciate that. So the memory function here is interesting. I don't think I'm quite following how it's supposed to be working. From the results of that, I would have to assume that either everything is great or everything is messed up. So I'm not really sure where to go from here on that one. But I will say that the other command I found interesting in the book is the read command. Now it looks like from a low level you can actually read any sector of a disk directly. This might give us some insight as to what's going on with the disk drive and why it's not booting. This will be interesting to see if we can actually get anything to read off of one of these disks. After much trial and error, I finally realized my mistake with these commands, and I felt very, very silly in that you cannot put a space in these commands. It doesn't understand that. Essentially, by me putting a space between whatever the letter command was and the first address or digit or whatever the parameter was, it was throwing off the system. So if I put in the R command for read and then I put in drive 0 and track 0 and sector 1, there we go. It's actually reading the contents of that particular sector. It is seeing the data on that first sector of the disk, which according to the manual is where it's supposed to load CPM from. So I'm not sure why this doesn't work, but it's probably going to take a little bit more analysis than we have time for in this video. So we're going to have to come back to the Xerox 820 a different day once we figure out a little bit more about the disk system. Of course, as always, I would like to encourage you, if you know about the system, if you've used it, if you have one, please sound off in the comments below. Let us know your feedback, maybe some of the things that we're doing wrong, like stupidly putting spaces in commands when they weren't supposed to have them. Maybe there's something else simple that I'm overlooking here. My first experience with the Xerox 820, I wouldn't say it was a rousing success, but I will say that the machine has potential. I think this is going to require a little bit more research on my part and trying to get this fully functional, but I'm excited about the possibility. Xerox, despite all of their innovations, really didn't have a lot available for the general consumer market. This is one of the few machines that were widely available to consumers, and over time, even though it didn't have huge selling numbers, may have been the last machine that Xerox actually made in the microcomputer world. So it does have a place in history. I'm glad that we have this in the museum, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it as we get some of the software to function. As a reminder, if you are into vintage computers and vintage tech, I encourage you to like and subscribe. It's going to help us a lot as we grow. And be sure to check out our website where you can become a Vintage Geek member. We've got all sorts of extra video content, some cool code snippets, discounts to the museum, and a whole lot more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.